You don't forget a sound like that. One moment I was power washing the exterior plaza of the Apex Tower, the water swirling around the granite at my feet. The next, a sharp crack, like a rifle shot from 50 stories up. I looked up just as a 3-foot piece of the building's decorative cladding slammed into the pavement 10 feet away. It exploded, sending shards of stone skittering across the concrete like shrapnel. A young woman with a stroller had frozen, dead still, her hand over her mouth. She'd been standing right there seconds before. My heart wasn't pounding from fear for myself. It was cold, solid dread. I knew what this was. What the hell was that? Leo, the building's facilities manager, came sprinting over, his face flushed. He didn't look at the broken granite. He looked at me, at the power washer in my hands. Clara!
What did you do?
I didn't do anything, Leo, I said, my voice steady, though my insides were trembling. The anchor failed. It's the spandrel panel on the 38th floor. I've been reporting the stress cracks in the mortar for months. He waved a dismissive hand, his eyes scanning the gathering crowd. Don't start with that technical garbage. You caused a public disturbance. You're lucky you didn't get sued. They see a 60-year-old woman in a maintenance uniform and they see a problem to be managed. What they don't see is the widow of the man who designed the very skeleton of this building. They don't see the person who knows bone deep that this wasn't an accident. It was a symptom, and it was only the beginning. Later that night, long after the plaza had been taped off and the executives had gone home to their quiet neighborhoods, I was still there. My cart's wheels whispered against the marble floors of the silent, empty tower. This was when the building talked to me, a creak from a stressed beam, the faint groan of the HVAC system working too hard, and the drafts, always the drafts where there shouldn't be, snaking out from the seams on the 34th floor. My husband Robert taught me to listen. He said buildings are like living things, and they tell you when they're sick. Jaxon Reid, the brilliant young CEO of Apex Dynamics, would never hear it. To him, this tower was just a logo, a backdrop for his IPO photo shoots. I'd hear him on the phone, his voice echoing in the atrium, talking about disruption and legacy. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. He was building his legacy on the skeleton of my husband's reputation. My route took me to the executive ventilation suite. A special filter needed replacing, a job no one else was trusted to do. As I unscrewed the panel, my flashlight beam caught something that shouldn't have been there. Not a tool, not a forgotten pen. A single folded sheaf of paper wedged deep into the ductwork as if someone had tried to hide it forever. I pulled it out. The cover sheet was blank. But the first page, Internal Engineering Assessment, Spandrel Anchor Failure, Critical, Do Not Circulate. My breath caught. My eyes scanned the technical data, the stress tests, the projected failure points. It was all there. Everything I'd suspected. But it was the conclusion that turned my blood to ice. Conclusive evidence of substandard alloy in anchor assemblies. Failure is not a question of if, but when. Liability is catastrophic. Original design per R. Evans was sound. Fault lies with material substitution approved by J. Reid Q4 2021. J. Reid. Jaxon. He didn't just know about the flaw, he'd caused it. To save a few dollars per unit, he'd signed the order that made this building a death trap. And he'd let my Robert take the blame for a flaw that never existed in the original plans. I leaned my head against the cold metal of the duct, the report trembling in my hand. Downstairs in my locker was a locket. Inside it, a picture of me and Robert, standing right here on this empty lot 20 years ago, holding the original blueprints, our faces full of hope. Jaxon Reid didn't just cover up a structural flaw. He buried my husband twice. First his reputation and now his masterpiece. But he made one mistake. He forgot that the woman who cleans the vents knows all his secrets, a secret like this. It's a heavy thing. You can't just shout it from the rooftop, not when the man on the top floor has everything to lose. I needed proof that would stand up in a boardroom, not just a hidden report that could be dismissed as a forgery. Or that I had planted myself. I needed an ally, someone who knew the language of stress and strain as well as I did. The next evening, I drove across town to a small, cluttered house with a porch light that always stayed on. I found Frank Donnelly in his garage, exactly where Robert said he'd always be, bent over a detailed model of a bridge. Frank was Robert's best friend, his partner for 30 years. He'd left the industry after Robert's death, too disgusted to play the corporate games anymore. He looked up from his work, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "Clara, is everything all right?" I didn't say a word. I just placed the folded engineering report on his workbench. He wiped his hands on a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. He opened it. I watched his face, the way his brow furrowed, his jaw tightening as he read the same damning lines I had. The color drained from his cheeks. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice gravelly with emotion. "From the building's lungs," I said. Jaxon tried to hide it in a ventilation duct. Frank took off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. I knew it. I knew Robert's design was sound. It was elegant. It was him. He looked at me, his eyes blazing with an old, familiar fire. "Jaxon didn't just cut corners, Clara. He committed murder with a spreadsheet. He signed a death warrant for that building and everyone near it." "The IPO roadshow starts in 3 weeks, I said, my voice low. "Once he gets that influx of cash, he'll bury this forever." "We have until then," Frank nodded, his mind already racing. "The report is a start, but we need the source. The original purchase orders for the substandard alloy, the internal memos. We need a chain of evidence that leads right back to Jackson's signature." It was my turn to nod. I had access. I had keys. I was a ghost in that machine. But the risk was now immense. The very next day, the atmosphere in the tower had changed. It was subtle, but I felt it. A new tension. Jackson's head of security, a grim-faced man I knew only as Davies, seemed to be everywhere. His eyes scanning the corridors, then the call came from HR. "Clara, we need you to come in for a random, mandatory drug screening." Immediately, my blood ran cold. It wasn't random. It was a pretext. They wanted me out of the building. They wanted to search my locker. I hung up the phone, my hand resting on the master key in my pocket. I had hidden the report in a new place, but they were getting close. Jaxon was rattled. A rattled snake is at its most dangerous. I looked down the long, shining hallway toward Jaxon Reid's corner office. He thought he could smoke me out with a cheap trick. But he didn't realize. I was the one who controlled the vents, and I was about to turn up the heat. The drug test was a farce. I stood in the sterile clinic playing my part, but my mind was miles away, back in the tower. I knew what was happening. While I was here, someone was turning my locker inside out. They found nothing, of course. I'm not foolish enough to keep my ammunition in the enemy's armory. The real evidence was tucked away in a place no one would ever look, the hollow core of a dropped ceiling tile in the women's restroom on the 2nd floor. A place so mundane, so utterly beneath their notice it was the perfect vault. But the message was clear. The hunt was on. That night, I became a shadow. My master key felt less like a tool and more like a weapon. I started in the archives, a dust-choked room in the sub-basement that smelled of damp paper and forgotten history. I found the purchase orders for the anchor assemblies just as Frank said I would. The specified alloy was right there, in Robert's precise handwriting. And then I found the change order dated 6 months later. Jackson's flamboyant signature was a slash of black ink authorizing a cheaper, weaker substitute. The cost savings were circled in red. A paltry sum, really. A rounding error on the IPO he was chasing. It was proof. But it was cold, technical proof. I needed to hear him say it. I needed to hear the lie in his voice. The next day, during the midday rush, I was cleaning the glass walls of the conference room adjacent to Jackson's office. He was inside, holding court with his inner circle. The door was cracked. I had a small, discreet voice recorder, the kind journalists use, tucked in the chest pocket of my uniform. I'd never used it before. It felt like a betrayal of my own nature, this act of deliberate espionage. But then I thought of Robert, and my hand steadied. I polished the glass, my body a silent statue, my ears straining. "The media tour for the IPO starts Monday," Jaxon was saying, his voice booming with confidence. "I want every narrative controlled. We are the future. We are untouchable." One of his sycophants, a young VP, laughed nervously. "What about the incident with the cladding? The maintenance woman has been making noises." I stopped breathing. Jackson's laugh was a short, cruel bark. That's handled. She's a lonely old woman who misses her dead husband. She's looking for a villain to blame for her pathetic life. Let her sweep up her dust and her delusions. The room chuckled on cue. But Jaxon wasn't done. His voice dropped, turning conspiratorial. Look, the original design was over-engineered. My substitution was a strategic improvement. Even if it wasn't, the board will never know. And by the time anyone else figures it out, we'll be so rich we can buy our own island and tell the world to go to hell. The recording light on my dev